The barometric pressure reading for October 14, 2019 at Point Reyes Station was logged at 28.11 inches of mercury. That number shouldn't exist. Not for that day, not for that location, not for that time of year. The lowest barometric reading ever reliably measured on the California coast was 28.53 during a catastrophic storm system in 1962. The National Weather Service has no record of any reading below 28.35 anywhere on the Pacific seaboard outside of a direct tropical cyclone landfall, and yet there it was, 28.11, handwritten in blue ballpoint ink, steady hand, no correction, logged at 03:47 local time. Beside it, in the margin, someone had written a single annotation: "They're already ashore. I need to back up. My name is Elias Coyne. I'm a freelance archivist. That's not a real job title, not in any traditional sense. What it means in practice is that I'm hired, usually by county offices, estates, small institutions, or occasionally historical societies, to organize, catalog, and digitize paper records that no one has looked at in years or decades. It's unglamorous. Most of the work involves mildew, dead silverfish, and filing cabinets that haven't been opened since someone retired or died. I got into it after spending 6 years working for a document management company in Sacramento. Left that job in 2017 when the contracts dried up, and discovered that California's smaller counties had enormous backlogs of unprocessed physical records. There's a surprising amount of work, if you don't mind the solitude and the dust. In March of 2023, I was contacted by the Marin County Parks Department, not directly, but through a guy I'd worked with before named Dale Loomis, who ran maintenance contracts for several parks in the Bay Area. Dale told me they'd been consolidating storage out of a set of old utility buildings near the Point Reyes National Seashore Administrative Complex. The Park Service manages most of Point Reyes, but there were a handful of structures that had been used cooperatively by county and federal staff over the years. Weather monitoring, trail coordination, fire lookout logistics. Some of those buildings were being decommissioned, and inside one of them, they'd found roughly 40 bankers' boxes of unsorted paperwork, some of it going back to the 1970s. Dale asked if I'd be willing to spend 2 or 3 weeks going through the material, sorting what needed to be preserved from what could be destroyed. Standard work. I agreed. I drove out to Point Reyes in the second week of April. If you haven't been there, it's hard to describe how isolated it feels despite being only an hour and a half from San Francisco. The peninsula juts out into the Pacific like a broken thumb. The geography is strange. Point Reyes sits on a different tectonic plate than the rest of Marin County, separated by the San Andreas Fault. The landscape doesn't match anything around it. It's windswept, foggy more days than not, and the coastline is sheer and hostile. There are beaches, but they're not the kind you sunbathe on. The currents are violent. Sharks patrol the waters around Tomales Point. The elk herds move through the hills like something from another century. The building I'd be working in was a single-story cinder block structure about a quarter mile off Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, down a gravel service road. It had been used, I was told, primarily as a weather relay station during the 1990s and early 2000s, before the automated systems made staffed stations mostly unnecessary. The inside was exactly what I expected. Gray industrial shelving, a small desk, a disconnected landline phone still mounted to the wall, and boxes, stacks of them. The electricity worked. There was a space heater. I had a folding table, a laptop, and a label maker. That was the setup. The first several days were uneventful. I sorted through budgets, maintenance logs, equipment requisition forms, interagency correspondence, trail damage reports, and a truly remarkable number of documents about fence repair. Point Reyes has a long history of ranching conflicts, and a lot of the older paperwork dealt with grazing boundaries and cattle grid replacements. None of it was historically significant. I flagged a few items. A hand-drawn map from the 1980s, showing planned trail reroutes. A set of photographs of the 1995 Vision Fire. But most of it was destined for the shredder. It was on the 5th day that I found the weather logs. They were in a box that had been taped shut with clear packing tape that had yellowed and gone brittle. The box was unlabeled. Inside were 11 composition notebooks, the standard black and white marbled kind, and each one was filled, cover to cover, with handwritten weather observations. Temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction, visibility, precipitation, cloud type and cover, barometric pressure. Every entry was time-stamped. The earliest notebook began on January 3, 2003. The latest entry I could find was dated November 1st, 2019. 16 years of weather logs, all handwritten, all by the same person. The handwriting was precise. Small, slightly left-leaning print, very consistent. Each entry followed the same format: date, time, then each variable, one per line, with values and occasional brief notes. Fog persisting below 200 feet. Wind gusting NNW, salt spray reaching station. Visibility less than quarter mile, foghorn audible from lighthouse. The logs weren't remarkable in themselves. Point Reyes has always been a site of meteorological interest. The peninsula experiences some of the most dramatic fog and wind conditions on the west coast, and its exposed position makes it a natural sentinel for incoming Pacific weather systems. What interested me was the dedication. 16 years of daily observations, multiple times per day, all by hand, all in the same careful script. Whoever had kept these logs had done so long after the station was officially decommissioned. The automated weather system at Point Reyes had been fully operational since at least 2005. These handwritten logs were, as far as I could tell, unofficial, redundant, maybe personal. I set the notebooks aside and kept working through other boxes. But I kept coming back to them during breaks. There was something compulsive about the entries. The way each one was a small, complete portrait of a moment in time. You could read an entry and feel the place. 4:12, temp 48 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity 97%, wind calm, fog total, ceiling approximately 80 feet, no stars visible, surf audible, heavy, barometric 30.02, falling slowly. It was almost meditative. I started reading them chronologically. For the first several notebooks, covering roughly 2003 through 2011, the logs were purely observational, dry, professional, weather, and nothing else. I noticed the observer had a particular fixation with fog, describing its texture and movement in unusual detail. But there were no anomalies, not yet. That changed in 2012. Starting in 2012, the entries began to change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but I noticed the observer had begun including a new category of notation that hadn't appeared in earlier logs. The notes were always at the end of an entry, separated by a short horizontal line, and they were written in a slightly different register, still factual but less rigidly structured. The first one I found was from February 9th, 2012. 3:30 observation. Standard conditions for season. Fog total, heavy, no wind. Barometric steady at 29.91. During observation, heard what I initially took for a foghorn, but interval was wrong. Approximately 6 seconds between pulses, whereas Point Reyes lighthouse horn operates on a 15-second cycle. Sound appeared to originate from the water, south-southwest. Lasted approximately 4 minutes. Did not repeat. I almost skipped past it. It reads like a mundane auditory note, maybe a ship's horn, maybe a distant buoy. But something about the specificity stuck with me. The observer had clocked the interval of the sound and compared it against the known foghorn cycle. They were precise about it. They weren't guessing. They were measuring. I kept reading. The next anomalous note didn't appear until May of that year. 2:15, fog moderate, patchy, lifting intermittently. Wind light, variable. During observation, noticed a light source approximately 200 to 300 yards offshore, bearing southwest. White, steady, not flashing. Too low to be a vessel running light. Appeared to be at or just above water level. Observed for approximately 12 minutes. Light did not move. Fog closed in and obscured it. When fog cleared again at 02:41, light was gone. Then nothing unusual for months. August 2012. 23:48, clear, no fog, wind. W15, gusting 22. Unusual for this clarity at this hour. During observation, detected a smell I have not encountered here before. Not organic decay, not kelp, not chemical. Closest description would be ozone, but stronger and with a mineral quality. Lasted approximately 90 seconds. Wind shifted slightly during this period, then resumed. Smell did not return. These notes continued to appear, scattered across the remaining notebooks, never more than 3 or 4 per month, often fewer. Sometimes weeks would pass with nothing but standard weather data. But the pattern was unmistakable once you were looking for it. The observer was documenting something alongside the weather, something they couldn't explain. And they were doing it with the same clinical discipline they applied to barometric pressure and wind speed. I want to be clear about something. At this point, I was interested, but not alarmed. Point Reyes is a wild, remote, genuinely eerie place, especially at night. The fog alone can produce disorienting sensory experiences. Sound travels strangely across water. Bioluminescence, while rare in that part of the coast, isn't impossible. I assumed I was reading the increasingly detailed observations of someone who spent too many nights alone on a foggy headland, and whose pattern recognition instincts were finding signal in noise. That's a very human thing to do. What changed my thinking was the entries from 2016 onward. On March 3, 2016, the Observer wrote, 1:20, fog total, extremely dense, visibility less than 30 feet, wind calm, barometric 29.78, falling. During observation, the fog exhibited lateral stratification that I have never previously recorded. A distinct boundary was visible, or rather, felt, at approximately chest height. Below this boundary, the fog appeared denser, colder, and moved independently of conditions above. I held my hand below and above the boundary repeatedly. Temperature differential was perceptible. Air below was still. Air above had slight intermittent movement. I have no explanation for this stratification under these wind conditions. A week later, 00:55, similar conditions to March 3rd, fog total. During observation, the stratification effect was present again. This time, I brought a thermometer and measured at knee height and head height. Knee, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Head, 47 degrees Fahrenheit. A 6-degree differential in less than 4 vertical feet. I also noticed that sound behaved differently below and above the boundary. Below, I could hear the surf clearly, as if amplified. Above, it was muffled, almost inaudible. I stood still for 11 minutes. During minute 7, I heard footsteps on the gravel path to the east, measured, even spacing. I called out, no response. Steps continued for approximately 30 seconds, then stopped. I walked to the path. No one there. Ground was wet, but I could not identify distinct prints due to the gravel surface. I read that entry 3 times. I read it once more, slowly, looking for any indication that the observer had editorialized, dramatized, or embellished. There was none. The language was identical in tone and precision to every weather observation they had ever made. 6 degrees of differential and 4 feet of vertical space. Measured. Sound propagation anomaly. Noted. Footsteps. Timed. Response attempted. No contact. Evidence checked. Inconclusive. I photographed that page. Over the following weeks, I read the remaining notebooks more carefully. The anomalous notes increased in frequency during 2016 and 2017, not dramatically, maybe 5 or 6 per month instead of 2 or 3, but the content became harder to dismiss. April 2016. Observed what appeared to be a figure standing at the edge of the bluff, approximately 150 yards south of the station. Fog was moderate. Figure was dark, upright, and motionless. I watched for 8 minutes. It did not move. I retrieved binoculars. By the time I returned, approximately 90 seconds later, the figure was gone. No sound of movement. Checked the area the following morning. Ground was soft from recent rain. There were no footprints. July 2016. During a rare clear night, approximately 1:30, I observed a disturbance on the water surface approximately half a mile offshore. The sea was calm, swell under 2 feet. The disturbance appeared to be a circular area, maybe 40 to 50 feet in diameter, where the water was behaving differently. Flatter, smoother, almost glassy compared to the surrounding surface. Moonlight was sufficient to see this clearly. The area persisted for approximately 20 minutes. Then the water returned to uniform conditions. No vessel traffic, no marine mammals visible. I checked tide tables and current charts afterward. Nothing explains a localized calm water anomaly of that size and duration. September 2016. 3:10. Fog heavy. During observation, my weather instruments behaved erratically. The anemometer registered sustained winds of 35 miles per hour for approximately 2 minutes, but I was standing in absolute calm, not a breath of wind. The vane pointed due south, then spun freely, then stopped at due south again. The barometer dropped from 29.95 to 29.61 in under 3 minutes, then returned to 29.93 over the next 5. I checked battery levels and connections. Everything appeared normal. I filed these readings but noted the discrepancy. I have no explanation. I need to pause here and talk about what it's like to read something like this when you're sitting alone in a cinder block, building a quarter mile off the road, on a foggy peninsula, at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, because that's where I was. Every day, I'd drive out, unlock the building, set up my table, and work. And every day, by about 4 in the afternoon, the fog would come in. I could watch it from the single west-facing window, a solid white wall sliding across the hills, swallowing the scrub and the fence posts and the service road. The sound changed when the fog arrived. The building would go from having a sense of surrounding space, wind in the grass, distant surf, a bird, to being wrapped in a kind of padded silence. The fog didn't muffle sound so much as replace it with its own particular quality of quiet. I was reading these notebooks in that silence. I started taking the notebooks back to my motel in Olima each night. I told myself it was because I wanted to photograph them properly for the catalog. That was true. But I was also reading them before bed, and I was doing it because I couldn't stop. The entries from 2017 introduced a new element. On January 22nd, the Observer wrote, "I have begun keeping a secondary log. This notebook will continue to contain standard weather observations. The secondary log will contain only the anomalous observations, with expanded detail and my attempts at analysis. I am doing this because the anomalous events are increasing in frequency, and I want to maintain the integrity of the weather record, while also properly documenting what I am experiencing." I looked through every box in that building. I never found the secondary log. But the Observer didn't entirely succeed in keeping the anomalous material separate. Notes continued to appear in the weather notebooks, though after January 2017, they were shorter, more clipped, often just references. See secondary log, entry 34. Repeat of the March 3rd stratification effect, more pronounced. Details in secondary. Light offshore again, third time this month. Secondary log. The references told me the secondary log existed, or had existed, and that it contained at least 34 entries by the time it was first mentioned. The numbers climbed as the months progressed. By the end of 2017, the Observer was referencing entry numbers in the 90s. I became fixated on two questions. Who was this Observer, and where was the secondary log? The first question turned out to have a surprisingly straightforward answer. In the earliest notebooks, there was no name, just the weather data. But in a 2009 notebook, on the inside, back cover, someone had written a phone number, and beneath it, the name R. Vasquez. I searched county employment records. Part of my archival access allowed me to cross-reference personnel files for the buildings I was cataloging, and found a Ramón Vasquez listed as a part-time weather station attendant for the Point Reyes relay station, hired in 2002, position eliminated in 2008 when the station was officially decommissioned. Position eliminated in 2008. But the logs continued until 2019. 11 years after the job ceased to exist, someone, almost certainly Vasquez, was still going out to that station and recording the weather by hand, multiple times daily through the night, alone, in the fog, for over a decade after anyone was paying him to do it. I looked for more information on Vasquez. There wasn't much. He had a Marin County library card that had last been used in 2020. He had no social media presence that I could find. A brief obituary in the Point Reyes Light, dated February 2021, confirmed that Ramón Elias Vasquez, 64, of Inverness, had died. The cause of death wasn't listed. No surviving family was mentioned. The obituary was 4 sentences long. It said he had worked for the National Park Service and had been a dedicated observer of local weather conditions. He died less than 2 years after the last entry in his weather log. There was a gap in the later notebooks. Nothing for the entirety of 2018, though the entries resumed in early 2019, suggesting a missing notebook. The final notebook picked up in January 2019 and ran through early November. The handwriting in this last notebook was different, not a different person. The letter forms were the same, but less controlled, slightly larger, occasional wavering in the lines. The observer's hand was less steady. The anomalous notes in this final notebook were more frequent, and more direct. They had lost some of their clinical detachment. February 2019. Fog again, thick, stratification present. I sat in the chair by the west window and watched. The lower layer moved. I want to be specific about this, against the direction of the upper layer. The upper fog drifted north, northeast, consistent with recorded wind. The lower layer moved south-southwest toward the station. There was no wind at ground level. I checked. The lower fog was moving on its own. I am not comfortable with what this implies about the previous observations. March 2019. I have started hearing the footsteps every time I come here at night. Not occasionally, every time. They begin between 100 and 200. They are always on the east path. They always stop when I go to look. I have set up a battery-powered trail camera on the east path. I will check it next visit. April 2019. Retrieve trail camera. It captured 14 motion-activated images over 3 nights. 12 show fog. 2 show what I first took to be fog. But on closer inspection, the density and shape are wrong. In both images, there is a region of higher opacity, approximately 5 feet 8 inches to 6 feet tall, roughly 15 feet from the camera. It is not a distinct figure. It does not have edges, but it is there, and it is shaped unlike any fog formation I have documented in 16 years of observation. I looked through the box for photographs. There were none. May 2019. The water anomaly is back. I can see it now without binoculars on clear nights. The calm circle. It has grown. I estimate 100 to 120 feet in diameter. It appears in the same location every time, approximately half a mile offshore, bearing 220 degrees from the station. It appears between midnight and 0400. It persists for longer periods now, sometimes an hour or more. I have noticed something I did not notice before, or perhaps something that has changed. The surrounding water does not behave as if encountering an obstacle or current differential. The boundary is sharp, like a hole cut in the surface of the ocean. June 2019. I waded into the water tonight. I do not know why I did this. It was not a decision I remember making. I was observing the calm circle from the bluff, and then I was on the beach, and then I was ankle deep. The water was warm, not slightly warm. Warm in a way that is not possible for the Pacific at this latitude in June. I estimate 72 to 75 degrees. The ambient water temperature at this time of year should be 50 to 53. I stood there for what I believe was several minutes. The sand under my feet felt wrong, smooth, almost frictionless, like silt, but without the organic smell. I came back to the station. My boots were dry by the time I arrived, which should not have been possible. I am writing this down because I need someone to eventually read it. I read that sentence 4 times. Each time, it settled deeper. I was sitting in my motel room in Olema when I read it. It was past midnight. The room had thin walls, and I could hear the wind outside. Point Reyes was less than 10 miles away, invisible in the dark. I put the notebook down and sat there for a while. I need to be honest about something. I am not a person who believes in the supernatural. I don't watch horror movies. I don't reread Creepypasta. I'm a middle-aged man who organizes old paperwork for a living. My instinct, sitting there in that motel room, was not fear. It was sadness. I was reading the disintegration of a meticulous, disciplined mind. Vasquez had spent 16 years alone on that headland, night after night, and his isolation had curdled into something. His perceptions had drifted. The precision that once served him, the careful measurements, the clinical notation style, had become the scaffolding for a delusion. That's how I saw it. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what happened next didn't happen to someone who was primed for it. I wasn't looking for something strange. I wasn't hoping to find anything. I wanted to finish the job and go home. The entries from July and August 2019 were sparse, only a few per week instead of the multiple daily observations that had characterized the previous 16 years. The handwriting continued to deteriorate. Several entries were incomplete. Time and date, a few measurements, then nothing. As if he'd started and then stopped, or left. September 2019 had only 4 entries. All 4 contained anomalous notes. September 7th. They come when the fog comes. I am now certain of this. September 14th. The footsteps are not on the path. They are around the building. They circle it, counterclockwise, slowly. I have timed the circuit at approximately 4 minutes, 30 seconds. The building's perimeter is roughly 200 feet. That is a walking speed of approximately 0.5 miles per hour. No one walks that slowly unless they are looking for something. September 22nd. The stratification is not a weather phenomenon. The lower layer is not fog. I don't know what it is, but it is not water vapor. It is too heavy, it is too cold, and it responds to my presence. When I stand still, it collects. When I move, it retreats. It is aware. I am being careful about that word. I understand the implications. But I have tested this repeatedly and the behavior is consistent. September 29th. Barometric reading 28.44. Instruments checked, rechecked. Reading confirmed with backup mercury barometer. This is not possible. I am recording it anyway. 28.44. Still impossibly low, though not as low as the final reading that would come 3 weeks later. The barometric pressure at sea level on the California coast does not drop below about 29.2, except in extreme storm conditions. A reading of 28.44 would correspond to a Category 4 hurricane, roughly. There was no hurricane. There was no storm. The Weather Service recorded nothing unusual for that date at Point Reyes. October 2019, 5 entries. The last 5 entries Ramón Vasquez ever wrote. October 2nd, went to the beach at low tide. The sand is different. In a strip approximately 20 feet wide, running parallel to the waterline, the sand has a different color, darker, almost gray. I collected a sample in a jar. It is heavier than normal sand. When I hold the jar up to light, it does not refract properly. The grains do not sparkle. They absorb the light. I do not understand what kind of mineral composition would produce this. I am placing the sample in the desk drawer. I checked the desk drawer. It was empty, but there was a ring stain on the wood, consistent with a glass jar. October 7th. Clear night, no fog. I sat outside and watched the water. The calm circle was present, larger than ever, and I could see something I have never seen before. Inside the circle, the water was not just flat, it was transparent. I could see the bottom. There is no bottom at that depth. The offshore bathymetry drops to 40+ feet within a quarter mile. But I could see a surface, pale, smooth, featureless, like a floor. It extended to the edge of the circle and stopped. Beyond the circle, normal ocean. Inside the circle, something underneath. October 10th. Fog, heavy, stratification present, strongest I have ever observed. Lower layer was knee-high and so cold my legs went numb within 3 minutes. I stood in it because I needed to see. The lower layer was moving toward the beach, slowly, but with what I can only describe as purpose. It did not disperse. It did not thin. It moved as a single coherent mass, like a body of water flowing downhill, except the ground was level. I followed it from a distance. It reached the waterline and continued into the surf. Where it met the ocean, the water went flat, still, glassy. The calm circle formed in real time, expanding outward from the point of contact. I watched it reach its full diameter in approximately 6 minutes. Then the fog retreated. It pulled back from the water, moved uphill, and collected around the station. I was inside it again. I went inside the building and locked the door. October 12th. I have been sitting here for 2 hours trying to decide whether to write this down. I need to. Last night, around 2:30, during a dense fog event, something knocked on the door of the station. 3 knocks. Slow, even. I did not answer. The knocking did not repeat. But I heard breathing. Not wind through the structure. Breathing. Rhythmic, slow, and very close to the door. It lasted approximately 5 minutes. Then the breathing moved. I tracked the sound as it circled the building, counterclockwise, like the footsteps. But this time, it paused at each window. There are 4 windows. It paused at each one. I could not see anything through the glass. The fog was total. But each time it paused, the glass fogged from the outside, as if something warm was standing very close to it, exhaling onto the surface. The condensation on each window formed in a pattern, not random, circular with a clear center, like something pressing its face against the glass. I was sitting at that desk, in that building, the same desk, the same windows. It was mid-afternoon when I read that entry, and the fog was already moving in from the west. I remember looking at the window, the one on the north wall closest to me, and trying to see if there was any trace of what he described. There wasn't. It had been 4 years, but I noticed for the first time that the window had been covered from the inside with a single layer of newspaper, taped along the edges. I had assumed it was for insulation or light blocking. The tape was old and yellowed. It had been there for a long time. All 4 windows had newspaper taped over them. I hadn't thought anything of it until that moment. October 14th, the last entry. I'm going to transcribe it in full because I think it matters. October 14th, 2019, 3:47. Temperature, 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity, 100%. Wind, calm. Visibility, 0. Fog, total, with extreme lower stratification. Lower layer has risen to waist height. Upper layer begins at approximately 5 feet and extends to unknown ceiling. Barometric pressure, 28.11. I have confirmed this reading 3 times. Mercury barometer agrees with digital. 28.11. Falling. The air pressure inside the building has changed. My ears are ringing. The door is bowed slightly inward, which should only happen in a significant pressure differential. I can feel it in my chest. The calm circle is visible from the bluff path I checked 30 minutes ago. It is expanded. I estimate it now covers an area of 500 feet or more in diameter. The pale surface beneath is clearly visible even in the reduced light. The footsteps are not outside. I need to be clear. The footsteps are not outside anymore. They are in the fog. They are everywhere in the fog. Not one set, multiple. I cannot count them. The sound fills the air from every direction, steady, rhythmic, on gravel that does not exist where the sound originates. I can hear them on the beach. I can hear them on the bluff. I can hear them on the road. The breathing has returned, but it is not at the door. It is ambient. The entire fog is breathing. I know how that sounds. I do not care. I have measured, observed, and recorded for 16 years. I am telling you what is happening. 28.11 and falling. The water is coming in, but it is not water. They're already ashore. That was the end. The rest of the notebook was blank. I sat with it for a long time. I remember the building was very quiet. The fog had come in while I was reading, and the light through the newspaper-covered windows had gone gray-white and diffuse. I could hear the wind, faintly, but it sounded far away, like it was happening somewhere above me. I photographed every page of the last notebook. Then I packed up for the day. I locked the building and walked to my car. The fog was thick. Not unusual for Point Reyes, not unusual for April, and the gravel service road was hard to see past about 50 yards. I drove back to Olima slowly. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the motel bed and thought about Vasquez. I thought about a man going out to a decommissioned weather station every night for 11 years after his job ended, recording data that no one had asked for, watching the fog and the water and the dark, documenting things he couldn't explain with the only tools he had: discipline and notation. I thought about the secondary log, the one with at least 90 entries, the one that was gone. The next morning, I did something I hadn't planned. Instead of going back to the building, I drove to the Point Reyes Light, the local newspaper office in Point Reyes Station. It's a small operation. Community journalism, weekly edition. I asked if they had archives I could look through. They did, digitized back to the late 1990s. I told them I was doing archival work for the county and asked if they had ever run anything about unusual weather events, coastal anomalies, or unexplained occurrences at or near the lighthouse area. The editor, a woman named Sharon, was helpful but clearly amused. She told me Point Reyes had a long history of weird stuff. The peninsula's isolation and geography attracted it. She mentioned the usual things: ghost stories about the lighthouse, shipwreck legends, the occasional tourist who claimed to see something in the fog. Then she leaned in slightly and said, "Old-timers in Inverness have a saying, don't watch the water after midnight when the fog comes from the southwest. They never explain why. They just say it's a local rule." I asked her what that meant. She shrugged. Probably nothing, but none of them break it. She told me that in all her years editing the paper, the only genuinely strange thing she'd encountered was an uptick in dead marine animals on Drake's Beach in late 2019, a few dozen bat rays and leopard sharks found on the sand over the course of a week in mid-October. The wildlife agencies had attributed it to an algal bloom or oxygen depletion event, but the water tests hadn't supported that. The story ran once and was forgotten. Mid-October 2019. The timing aligned. I asked Sharon about Ramón Vasquez. She knew the name. "The weatherman," she said. "He'd been a fixture in the area. People had seen him driving out to the station at odd hours for years. She said he'd been a quiet person, kept to himself. She told me he'd been found dead in his home in Inverness in early 2021. She thought it might have been a stroke or a heart attack. She mentioned that someone from the Park Service had come by the paper after his death, asking if Vasquez had ever submitted any documents or letters for publication. He hadn't. Someone from the Park Service had come looking for documents. I thanked Sharon and left. I sat in my car in the parking lot for several minutes, thinking. Then I drove to the Marin County clerk's office in San Rafael. I pulled Vasquez's death certificate. Cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. Place of death, his residence. Date, January 31st, 2021. There was nothing unusual about it on paper. But there was an addendum. In the section reserved for additional notes, the certifying physician had written, "Decedent found in a state of advanced hypothermia, inconsistent with indoor ambient temperature. Core body temperature at discovery measured at 84 degrees Fahrenheit. Residence thermostat set at 68 degrees Fahrenheit and functioning. No evidence of exposure. Contributing factor to cardiac event, undetermined hypothermia. He was found frozen in a warm house." I went back to the building the next day. I want to describe exactly what I found because I've gone over this many times in my head, and I need to be precise. When I arrived at approximately 9:30 in the morning, the fog was already in. This was unusual. The marine layer at Point Reyes typically doesn't push inland until the afternoon. The fog was low, very low. It clung to the ground like something poured. The hilltops above the service road were in full sunlight, and I could see a clear blue sky directly above, but at ground level, I was in white. I unlocked the building and went inside. Everything was as I'd left it. Boxes on the shelves, table, laptop, notebooks stacked on the right side of the desk. I sat down and started to work on cataloging the remaining non-weather boxes. At approximately 11:15, I noticed the temperature inside the building had dropped, not slightly. I was wearing a jacket and I could see my breath. I checked the space heater. It was on, running. I held my hand in front of it and felt warmth. The heater was functioning, but the room was cold in a way that didn't make sense. The cold seemed to be coming from below, from the concrete floor. I stood up and looked down. The floor was sweating. A thin film of condensation covered the concrete, as if the slab had suddenly become much colder than the air. My shoes left prints in the moisture when I walked. I went to the window, the one on the west wall with the newspaper taped over it. I peeled back a corner and looked out. The fog was at waist height. I'm telling you what I saw. The fog had a defined upper surface, like water in a pool, and it lapped at the cinder block wall of the building about 3 feet off the ground. Above that line, the air was clear. I could see the hilltop, the blue sky, a red-tailed hawk circling. Below the line, white, dense, opaque, motionless. I let the newspaper fall back and stepped away from the window. That's when I heard it. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I've thought about it every day since. From outside, from the east side of the building where the gravel path runs, I heard footsteps, slow, even, on gravel. They moved from north to south along the east wall, paused, and then continued around the corner to the south wall, then the west wall, then the north wall, back to the east wall, counterclockwise. The full circuit took approximately 4.5 minutes. Vasquez had timed it at 4 minutes and 30 seconds. I did not go to the door. I did not look out the window. I stood in the center of the room and listened. The footsteps completed one full circuit, paused, and began again. Same speed, same rhythm, same direction, counterclockwise. I am not someone who panics. But I will tell you that my body responded before my mind did. My hands were shaking. My mouth was dry. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Some part of me, some pre-rational, mammalian part, understood something that my conscious mind was still trying to reject. The footsteps completed the second circuit and stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It had a quality of attention, as if whatever had been walking was now standing still, listening. Then I heard the breathing. It was at the door, Slow, deep, rhythmic, not wind, not pipes, not the building settling, breathing. I could hear it clearly because the building was otherwise perfectly silent. No wind, no surf, no birds. The fog had swallowed everything except what was standing on the other side of a 2-inch steel door. I stared at the door. It was closed, locked. The deadbolt was thrown, and I watched. I watched as the door flexed inward, just slightly, a subtle bowing as if pressure was being applied from outside. Not force, pressure. Like the entire atmosphere on that side of the door was leaning against it. The breathing continued for what I estimate was 3 minutes. Then it moved. I tracked the sound as it passed the first window, paused, passed the second window, paused, the third, the fourth. Each time I heard it stop. Each time I imagined what Vasquez had described, something pressing close to the glass, exhaling onto the surface, fogging the window from outside. I didn't check. I didn't pull back the newspaper. I couldn't. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app. If something was out there, I wanted to record it. I held the phone against the door. The breathing continued. I pressed record. 2 minutes later, when I played it back, there was nothing on the file except static. No breathing, no footsteps, just white noise that sounded, if I listened too long, like water moving underground. I packed my things in under 2 minutes. I left the notebooks on the desk. I wasn't thinking about the job. I wasn't thinking about the catalog. I was thinking about my car and the road and how far away I could get. I unlocked the door, opened it, and stepped outside. The fog was at ankle height now. It had dropped or receded or settled. The air above was clear and bright, and the sun was shining, and the hills were green, and the hawk was still circling. I could hear the surf again, distant but normal. Everything looked exactly the way Point Reyes is supposed to look on a spring afternoon. I walked to my car. I drove to Olima. I checked out of the motel. I called Dale Loomis and told him I was taking a few days off from the project for personal reasons. He said fine. I drove home to Sacramento. I didn't go back for a week. During that week, I did research. I want to tell you what I found because it's the part of this that I keep coming back to. It's the part I can't resolve. Point Reyes has the highest concentration of documented shipwrecks on the California coast. Over 50 vessels have gone down within a few miles of the point. Many of them were never recovered. Some were never fully accounted for, meaning the number of bodies found didn't match the number of people aboard. This is attributed to currents, sharks, the depth of the water. It's a reasonable explanation. But there's a pattern in the wreck reports that I noticed when I started reading them carefully. In at least 9 of the documented wrecks between 1887 and 1941, the surviving crew or witnesses reported the same thing before the vessel foundered: a sudden, drastic drop in barometric pressure, followed by dead calm, followed by fog of unusual density that appeared to rise from the water rather than roll in from the open ocean. In the 1908 wreck of the SS Doris, a steamer that went down less than a mile offshore, the second mate, one of 11 survivors, testified during the inquiry that the ship had entered a zone of flat water shortly before striking the submerged rocks. He described the water inside this zone as warm as a bath and said the ship's instruments had stopped functioning. He also said, and this was noted in the inquiry transcript but never followed up on, that several of the crew who went into the water were pulled down, not by current but as if grasped. In the 1923 wreck of the Point Reyes, a cargo vessel, The captain's final radio transmission included the phrase, "Water calm, unable to determine position, something in the fog." The ship was found the next day, grounded on the rocks. The captain was not among the dead or the survivors. His body was found 2 weeks later on Limantour Beach, 7 miles south. The coroner's report noted that the body showed signs of hypothermia, but was otherwise uninjured. The water temperature at the time of the wreck was approximately 51 degrees Fahrenheit. The estimated time of immersion before death was less than 2 hours. Hypothermia in 51-degree water typically takes 6 to 8 hours to become fatal in a healthy adult. He froze too fast, just like Vasquez froze in a warm house. I found one more thing, and it's the thing that made me decide to tell this story publicly. In 2004, the United States Geological Survey conducted a seafloor mapping survey of the waters off Point Reyes as part of a larger California coastal mapping project. The data is publicly available. It shows the expected bathymetry: a gradual shelf dropping to deeper water, rocky substrate, sand channels, the usual topography. But in one area, approximately half a mile offshore, bearing roughly 220 degrees from the location of Vasquez's weather station, the sonar data contains an anomaly. Over an area of approximately 150 feet in diameter, close to the size Vasquez estimated. For the calm circle, the seafloor appears to be approximately 30 feet shallower than the surrounding bottom. The USGS report mentions this in a footnote and attributes it to a probable sonar artifact or localized sediment accumulation. I contacted a marine geologist at UC Davis and asked, hypothetically, what could cause a 30-foot rise in the seafloor in a circular pattern. She said, most likely a data error. If the data was accurate, maybe a volcanic intrusion, but there's no volcanic activity in that area. Maybe a mud diaper, but those are typically associated with methane seeps, and there are no known seeps at that location. I asked her if there was any geological process that could cause the seafloor to rise over time. She said yes, several, but they operate on scales of thousands or millions of years. I asked her what if the rise was recent. She paused and said she wouldn't want to speculate. I went back to Point Reyes. I had to. I'd left the notebooks there. I'd left the job unfinished. And if I'm honest, I went back because Vasquez had spent 16 years trying to document what was happening, and his records were sitting on a desk in an empty building, and if I didn't catalog them, no one would. They'd end up in a dumpster. I drove out on a Tuesday morning, clear sky, no fog. One of those rare Point Reyes days when the peninsula looks almost Mediterranean. Golden grass, blue water, sharp light. I unlocked the building. Everything was where I'd left it. The notebooks, my equipment. The floor was dry. The room was the normal temperature. I almost felt foolish. I spent the day finishing the other boxes. Standard paperwork, nothing remarkable. At around 3 p.m., I started the formal process of cataloging the weather notebooks. I photographed every page. I created a spreadsheet index. I handled the books with cotton gloves because some of the older pages were fragile. As I was photographing the final notebook, the one with the October 14th entry, I noticed something I had missed before. On the very last page, the one after "They're already ashore," there were faint indentations. Someone had written on a page that had since been torn out. The torn edge was clean, not ragged, cut with a blade or very carefully pulled. Whatever had been written on the next page had been removed. I angled the notebook under my work light and used a pencil, a technique I'd learned years ago, rubbing the graphite lightly over the indentations to see if I could recover any of the text. It was only partially successful. Most of the impressions were too faint. But in the upper right corner, I could make out what appeared to be a date. October 15th. And below that, several lines of text, only fragments of which were legible. Not fog, coming from the floor. They look like... And then, lower on the page, pressed harder into the paper as if the writer had been bearing down. Do not go to the water. That was all I could recover. October 15th. Vasquez had made at least one more entry after "they're already ashore." Someone had torn it out. Someone from the Park Service had gone to the newspaper after his death, asking about documents. Someone had emptied the desk drawer where he'd stored the sand sample. The secondary log, 90+ entries, was gone. I finished the cataloging. I boxed the weather notebooks separately and labeled them for preservation. I wrote a note to Dale recommending that the notebooks be transferred to a proper archive. I don't know if that happened. I locked the building for the last time and walked to my car. It was late afternoon, and the fog was starting to come in from the west. I could see the white wall building on the horizon. I got in the car and drove to the main road. As I turned onto Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, I looked in the rearview mirror. The service road behind me was disappearing into the fog, and at the far end, just before the white swallowed everything, I saw something standing in the road. Dark, upright, motionless, approximately the height of a person. I watched it in the mirror for 2, maybe 3 seconds before the fog closed around it. I did not stop. I did not go back. I drove to Sacramento. I uploaded all the photographs to 3 separate cloud accounts and a physical hard drive. I typed up my notes. I wrote this account. I want to say one more thing, and then I'm done. 3 weeks after I left Point Reyes, I received an email from Dale Loomis. He said the county had decided not to archive the contents of the building. Everything was being destroyed. He thanked me for my work and said the check was in the mail. A week after that, I searched for the USGS bathymetric data I had looked at earlier, the specific survey data for the area half a mile offshore of Point Reyes. The survey that showed the 30-foot anomaly had been removed from the public database. The rest of the California Coastal Survey was still there. Just that section was gone. In its place was a note. Data under review. Contact USGS Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center for inquiries. I contacted them. I received an automated reply saying my inquiry had been received and would be addressed in the order it was received. That was 11 months ago. I haven't heard back. I have the photographs of every page of Vasquez's weather logs. I have the index I created. I have the pencil rubbing of the torn-out page. I have the screenshots I took of the bathymetric data before it was removed. I don't know what Ramón Vasquez saw. I don't know what walked around that building. I don't know what's under the water half a mile off Point Reyes. I don't know who took the secondary log, or who tore out the last page, or why the survey data was pulled. But I know what he wrote. I know his readings were precise. I know his observations were consistent over 16 years. I know he died of hypothermia in a heated house. And I know that on the last night he made a record, the barometric pressure was 28.11, a number that cannot exist. And he wrote, in the same steady hand he'd used for 16 years of weather observations, 5 words that I think about every single day. They're already ashore. I don't go to the coast anymore. I check the fog reports for Point Reyes every morning. I don't know what I'm looking for, but I check. Last week, the automated weather station at Point Reyes recorded a barometric pressure reading of 28.97 at 3:12 a.m. The National Weather Service flagged it as an instrument error. Maybe it was. But this morning, I woke up at 3:47 a.m., the same time as Vasquez's final entry. I didn't set an alarm. My phone was on the nightstand. The screen was dark. When I picked it up, the weather app was open. Point Reyes, barometric pressure, 28.11. I refreshed the page. The reading changed to 30.02. Normal. I checked my phone's screen time report later. The weather app had been open for 6 minutes, starting at 3:47 a.m., ending at 3:53. I was asleep the entire time.